I do want to introduce our first guest for the evening. He is a veteran broadcaster from CNN, from the WWE, and more than likely you guys know him from WCW. We've got Mr. Christopher Cruz. Chris, how are you this evening?
Hey guys, how you doing? I'm glad to be with you.
Well, we are just doing too great tonight. We are looking forward to talking with you. I know we do have limited time with you, so I want to go ahead and get started with a few questions. Now, you started off your broadcast career at CNN, but you were never a quote-unquote journalist. Can you tell me a little bit about the differences between being a broadcaster and a journalist?
Well, maybe I got that wrong because I was always a broadcast journalist, but, in broadcasting there are people who are journalists and there are kind of sort of news readers and presenters. And that's okay. I mean, in Great Britain, they have that term that you're just, for lack of a better phrase, a pretty face on television who's presenting the news, and so,
yes.
and so you have those folks. So I anchored, but generally, you don't get to anchor unless you've kind of sort of worked your way up the ranks as a reporter. That's usually the case. Now there are some, smaller stations that will hire former beauty pageant contestants. And, they'll be anchors, and that's fine. But, you shouldn't confuse the two. They're just, smiling, white-teethed, beautiful men and women who present the news, but they're not journalists.
Well, excellent. I'm sorry I got that confused. How did you get your start with CNN then?
Well, I was, just like so many people, you start in a smaller market. I was born in Maine and grew up in Portland, Maine. And then I, from there just was, doing radio news and radio broadcasting. I was an Army broadcaster. And, I think maybe one of the things that I was talking to my wife about this earlier today, actually, is that you feel like you want to move up in the world, or for instance, I've got a friend who's here in Washington, D.C., and he and I were reporters together in Portland, Maine. And we were commenting that there are some people that we were reporters with 30 years ago in Portland who were still there, and that's fine. That doesn't mean that they're small market or medium market, or that they can't cut it at the network level. It just means that they were satisfied with their station in life. I always wanted to make it to the network level, and I made it to CNN. I'm now at the Voice of America. I also anchor on the weekends on the 800 station Westwood Radio Network on Saturday and Sunday mornings. And as you know, I'm now doing AAA. And that's throughout Canada and hopefully throughout the country and the world. So it's just it's a question as to whether you want to, be happy in your small town or your medium-sized town, or even if you're happy in Chicago or New York or Los Angeles. I just wanted to have a national and international presence. I felt I had the drive, the ambition, and the talent to do so, and that was validated when I did get to the national and international level.
Well, then, what brought you? The story that I've read is that you had asked to be transferred over to WCW when it was being led by Jim Herd. What led you to that decision?
Well, I wasn't. What had happened was I was, interestingly enough, I was only making $19,000 a year in the mid-'80s at CNN, including anchoring on headline news and on at the time they had a 400-station radio network. And so I got an offer at WGST, which was the all-news station in Atlanta, to basically double my salary and do a lot less work doing morning drive news. And so I went there. And then I really wanted to go back to Maine. I guess, I was at that point, having gone directly from Maine to Atlanta, it was a bit of a culture shock. And so I went back to Maine and did television news. But then the way that I got to WCW was I was in Maine, working for a guy, believe it or not, his name was Jack Nicholson. And I was not working for him, but I was reporting on events at the Cumberland County Civic Center, which he managed at the time. And I had always been a wrestling fan since I was 9 years old. And I knew that he knew Vince McMahon. Again, this was the mid-'80s. And McMahon was powering up for WrestleMania. We didn't call it WrestleMania 1. We called it WrestleMania because who knew if there was going to be a 2? And so from there, they needed some public relations and media relations help. And I moved down to Greenwich, Connecticut and stayed there for about 6 months and handled media and public relations for WrestleMania. Then, that was over. That, he wasn't hiring a bunch of people permanently. It was just, a short-term thing, and I was glad to have it. He gave us all $1,000 bonuses, and we went home. And from there, I went back to Portland, and then I knew this was the late 80s, and I knew that WCW, because I was reading the Observer newsletter, and I knew that WCW needed an announcer. I'm trying to think why. I think because they were expanding. And so I just called up Jim Hurd one day, kind of as a cold call, and he took the call, and I did some things in South Carolina as a trial. And I think people were maybe surprised and impressed that I both was a good broadcaster and that I also knew wrestling moves. And I guess that's kind of where it started.
Huh. So during your time leading up to WrestleMania, did you have any interaction with any of the big celebrities that were promoting that, like Liberace or Muhammad Ali or Mr. T or any of those guys?
Well, yeah, actually, I was with Liberace a couple of times, just a genuinely sweet man, when we would, he was, being a guest at different places and promoting the show. So I would help him with, some of the questions and dealing with issues in the green room. And then for a time, I traveled actually with Hulk Hogan and Mr. T, in the build-up. I was on private planes with them as they, we traveled the country. And so it was interesting. Mr. T and Hogan didn't seem to enjoy one another's company that much. Maybe they were just so very, very busy. But yeah, I did. And, you would find that most celebrities, especially if they're dealing with strangers, are fairly nice. They don't, especially now in the age of social media, but even back then, they don't want word to get out that they're dicks or jerks, So, all of the celebrities that I met were very nice.
Did you notice any friction between, I know you'd mentioned Hogan and T, but, I know that Roddy Piper has gone on many interviews and said that he didn't want an outsider in the business. You were an outsider at that point. Did you get any friction for that?
No. The interesting thing is, if you're from the office, if you're wearing a suit and tie, what wrestlers know is there's so much, negativity and so much backstage politics. And so wrestlers generally, they're not sure who's in power in the office, and so they want to be nice to everybody. And for me, the perfect example of that is that not all the wrestlers were all that nice to Eric Bischoff. Eric was, as he stated before, he was a C-level announcer. But one of the guys that was nice to him, and frankly, he was nice to everybody, was Diamond Dallas Page. And so, when most of the other wrestlers treated Eric as the C-level announcer that he was, they would treat me as the B-level announcer that I was. And that was understood. You were an announcer. You weren't a star. But it's funny because I remember early on, I had to go backstage. It was somewhere in Connecticut, and McMahon sent me to talk to Strongbow or something, or get something from Strongbow. So not knowing much about the business, I just walked back into the locker room. And Strongbow looked at me like, what the, who are you and what are you doing here? And I either got the message or got the briefcase or whatever he was supposed to give me and got it and went the heck home. So, it just takes a while if you're not born and raised in the business and if you don't know the business well or haven't been clued into it. And one thing that I always knew, I'm not an athlete, and I always understood that whether you were an undercard guy or a main eventer, you took the bumps and you needed to have respect. And frankly, it wasn't that difficult because, what I learned pretty early on is even the smallest guys in pro wrestling are big men. They're big people, and these are tough guys, and you just don't want to mess with them.
That is so true. Well, speaking of big guys, I'm going to shoot you on over to the biggest guy on the panel tonight, the incredible Huck, Will Huckabee. What do you have for Mr. Cruz?
Well, first of all, Mr. Cruz, I like to say thank you for being a guest on the show.
Well, thanks, Huck. It's great to be here.
Thank you. Now, my first question is because, you mentioned earlier that you come from a small town in Maine and stuff, and you worked your way up to what was at one point the biggest news station in the world. And that speaks a lot about your character and your drive. And I wanted to ask you, how much determination, how much hard work, how many doors were closed in your face before you finally got that open door stuff into CNN?
Well, it's an interesting question. It's funny because I was talking to my wife about this as well. There's that phrase that a prophet is without honor in his own home. And I was kind of banging around a little bit. I was at the CBS affiliate in Maine right after I got out of the Army radio. And, everybody in radio wants to move to television because there's more glamour and, you get recognized and there's more money and frankly, less work and less terrible hours. So I wanted to move to television. Well, I got some part-time work at the NBC affiliate, and they had this weird thing that they had a morning news show on the weekends where they would just put up slides, but they wouldn't show you on camera. So I was still doing radio, except it was on TV. And I would look at these guys, and I'd say, based on my television experience in the Army, I'd say, I know I can anchor. I know I can do this stuff. And yet, I would do a few auditions at the different television stations in Maine, even some smaller ones. Wouldn't get any offers. I got one offer up in Bangor that was just ridiculously low. And so I said, well, I'm just not going to get any respect in my own home. So I went to CNN radio. I knew I could, I just kind of sort of, having grown up listening to Christopher Glenn, who did the In the News program on Saturday mornings. Ironically enough, the building that I work in on the weekends is co-located with the CBS Washington Bureau. So I'm there on M Street Saturday and Sunday mornings. But, I knew I could do it, and yet I wasn't getting a chance in my own hometown. And so I went to CNN and CNN radio, and then I knew we were basically right next door to CNN Headline News, and I knew that they needed some fill-in stuff. And I just did an audition. That's the way it is with me. I mean, I'll try anything. I'll realize that, nobody ever died from being told no, and I'll give it a shot. And I'll realize that I might be good, I might be great, but I might not be the person that's needed at that point by that station. So it wasn't a whole lot of hard work. I write a column on news writing for the Radio and Television Digital News Association, and I interview some folks who are successful in the major markets. And I'll tell you, most of them have spent 10, 15, 20 years in these small markets, making really not a whole lot of money, and finally getting to that level. And that's the other thing that you realize is you can stay in broadcasting for a long time and find work here and there. But unless you've really got talent or the drive or the ability or the right connections, you'll always be just kind of a low-level guy. You'll always make a decent buck, but you'll never be, a star or a superstar, and you'll never get to the network level. There's certainly a lot of luck involved, but at some point you've got to exhibit some measure of talent.
Now speaking of that, in professional wrestling, I know you've heard it several times before. You only hear about guys finally getting it. Finally understanding how to draw money and how to put together a match and how to tell a story and stuff. Not only as a broadcast journalist, but also as a ring announcer. At what point, what was the instant, that you realized that you had it, that you got it and you had what it took to get to that next level?
In terms of, I think fairly early on at WCW, because I was confident of my broadcast skills. But the other thing is that in terms of understanding wrestling, it took a long, long time for me to get there because nobody really clued me in. And I think because they heard the power of my voice and they knew I was a good broadcaster and that I knew some of the moves, that I was also a good storyteller. But in fact, I wasn't, and I still struggle with that, frankly. I mean, there are a lot of talented broadcasters and a lot of people who know the moves, but and so maybe you can get to the B or the B plus level. But how do you get to the Jim Ross level, the A and the A plus level? And that comes from storytelling. That's a talent that I don't have. It comes from long history working in the business. Again, that's something that I don't have. So I can inject drama. I can sell the moves, but I'm not, I don't think, an A-level announcer in the sense of being able to, to tell the story. And so I don't know whether that's because I just haven't applied myself. I mean, I've never, been in the business for a long, long time to be able to apply myself to that and to be coached, frankly. I've had a couple of coaching sessions with Jim Ross. I wish I'd had a lot more. And there are some people who are just plain good storytellers, and I'm just not. That's one of the things I learned as I approach my 60s, is you've got to know what you can do and what you cannot do. And you know your strengths and your weaknesses. And, you know, that famous movie line, a man's got to know his limitations. So, but there does come a time when you know you can hit your marks, when you know that, you know, you can call the moves and sell the match. But at some level you say, look, I'm at a certain point in my career, I'm going no further, and you've got to be satisfied with that.
Now, here's my last question I've got to ask you, is because I'm assuming, you know, there's a lot of wild, crazy parties and stuff with, like, news anchormen and ladies and stuff and journalism. Any wild, crazy stories backstage right there at WCW or at WWE?
Well, I mean, a lot of the guys, you know, things have changed from the 80s to the 90s to now. One of the things I think that I was most surprised by is how the guys, they were kind of sort of cliques backstage, that you guys would know each other or not know each other. You think all famous people know one another. I also was very surprised by the fact that there are a lot of people who don't like one another who can work very well in the ring together. That surprised me. The other thing is, years ago, you know, that famous Vader incident with Paul Orndorff at Center Stage in Atlanta?
Oh, yes. You
remember that? Well, Vader had asked me to bring him some tapes, some Japanese tapes or some tapes or whatever. And I happened to be backstage and I gave them to him. He was very subdued. And it wasn't until like weeks later that I realized that incident had just happened. So, you know, so I was there and I didn't even know it, because Vader's usually pretty ebullient and everything. The other thing is that, I think you'd be surprised at how really, really intelligent many of these guys are. Some of them have school intelligence and academic intelligence. Others are just fantastic readers of people, whether that leads to being able to con you or not. You know, so much of entertainment is basically a con. And the other thing that I've always been surprised by is how the boys try to work one another. You know, they'll talk about the places that they drew, and I was always amazed, because I was like, it's a con man trying to con a con man. And neither one of them was falling for it, but they each tried to do it. It was just amazing to me.
Oh, that still goes on. I will go ahead and pass it to the newest member of the Undisputed Wrestling Show, Sandra. What do you ask?
Well, Mr. Cruz, one of the promotions that you announced for after WCW was the WXO. It was not around for a long time, but it managed to have national syndication and to become sort of a cult classic among fans that remember it. What were your impressions going into the WXO, and what did you think that the future was when you first got approached by the people running it to work for them?
I really thought it was going to make it. And to this day, I don't understand why it didn't. They seemed to be professional. It seemed to have all of the right things. The arenas, they had the television lined up. They had the booking down straight. And, you know, what I've since learned is that syndication started to really weaken for professional wrestling, I guess, because the individual stations didn't want wrestling, or at least national wrestling. Maybe they would take local or regional, and that wrestling was more of a cable product. So it was always a surprise to me. I've still got the black WXO shirt that they gave us, and all of a sudden it just kind of petered out. And but you know, I asked a lot about the When Worlds Collide pay-per-view, and I think probably the second thing that I'm asked a lot about is the WXO promotion. And I've never understood what happened to that. I guess maybe you could say it was a money thing. But I thought that they had that under control too. So I'll tell you, it was a real big disappointment.
And none other than Ted DiBiase was a frontman for the company, correct?
I think Ted was, yes. And I'm trying to think who else was involved. Was Orndorff involved with us as well?
Not to my knowledge.
Okay. But it just, everything seemed to be very professional. And I thought, part of me thought, geez, is this like There's some people who used to be at WCW or NWA or WWF at the time who have gotten together and decided they wanted their own thing. I was so happy to be involved with it. And then all of a sudden, they just didn't do it anymore. So it was just a real disappointment, I'll be honest with you.
Speaking of the AAA pay-per-view when Worlds Collide, you, in the last few months, were brought on board to help out with AAA's English language broadcast. What was the deal like there when they approached you to be on board with them, and had you called a lot of Lucha Libre wrestling besides that when Worlds Collide pay-per-view?
No, I hadn't, and I was just thrilled to hear from them. I live not too far from Union Station in Washington, D.C., so what happens is we do it in New York, actually one stop above Penn Station, which is New Rochelle. I get on a train at about 5 in the morning, usually every other Thursday. I'm up there by 9, have a nice breakfast, and from 10 till about noon, we do the commentary, and then I get on a train and come on back home. So it's all one day for me. They've been very patient with me. There's a lot of resources now online that will. One of the things I love doing is learning about the wrestlers that I'm calling the matches for, and learning the moves is, I think, absolutely essential. Learning the culture is absolutely essential. So Hugo Savinovich has been just very patient and very kind and very giving. So we're about to do our 4th session next week. And so I finally feel like that we're getting into the rhythm of things. And I'll tell you, it's so easy to call because the action is just so fast and furious, but there's storylines that have to be told. Again, you're always telling a story, not just calling the action. So it's fresh and it's new and exciting for me in a way that I never thought that, that it would be again in pro wrestling.
Well, I'm going to pass things back over to Zane Paisley as we wrap up with you. So thank you very much for taking the time to be on the Undisputed Wrestling Show.
Well, thank you. It's been a pleasure. I hear about you guys all the time, and it's really a thrill to be with you.
Well, those are very kind words, Mr. Cruz. So currently the English version of AAA is available in Canada. Are there any certain networks that it's on?
I think it's on the Fight Network. And I know that, I'm not too familiar with the inner workings of AAA and Lucha Underground. I know that there are some guys who are signed with both promotions. And so there are some, I don't know if it's copyright, trademark, or rights limitations. I'd certainly love to see the show on in the United States. I'd love to see it on overseas. But for right now, it's on the Fight Network. And I guess there's the FITE Fight Network and then the FIGHT Network. And I'm not quite sure of the difference between the two. But I know that the Fight Network, I think FIGHT in Canada, is coming up with a wrestling block on Tuesday nights. And so that's pretty exciting. So I guess it's midnight Eastern tonight is when AAA is going to be on. And it's basically the best of AAA, Lucha Libre worldwide. Their pay-per-views, their big arena matches. And you really see marquee matches. I just, I usually get the rundown a couple of days before we go up, and it's just exciting. I'm like, this is main event matches time after time after time. So it's really I think it's about 90 minutes long. It's a great hour and a half broadcast. It's great production. I think that, that I sell it well, and I'm certainly legitimately excited by it. And Hugo Savinovich, you all know from WWE, does a great job on color commentary. And I'm really hoping this can build and we can look at this because, as you all know, Lucha Libre has kind of had fits and starts. I mean, I thought when Worlds Collide, when that pay-per-view came out, that it was the beginning of the explosion of Lucha Libre in the U.S., and it just hasn't happened. But I think now there's a tipping point, an inflection point of Hispanics in major markets and major cities throughout the United States and in Canada that will support this product. At least I hope so.
Well, I definitely agree with you. And, we could debate the reasons why Lucha Libre hasn't taken over in the United States, but we don't have that much time with you. Well, want to thank you so much for being on with us tonight. How can our listeners follow you and keep up with what you're doing? I know that
they can follow me. Yeah, they can follow me on Facebook. I'm on Twitter. My Twitter handle is Crispy Cruiser. That was the name that Terry Funk gave me, so it's at Crispy Cruiser. And they can listen to all of our stuff is online at the Voice of America. I'm in the Learning English branch, so they can go to voanews.com or learningenglish.voanews.com. And then I get a lot of messages on Facebook from people around the country on Saturday and Sunday mornings. Like, for instance, Mike Leno, Dr. Mike Leno, who you all know from wrestling, listened to me out in San Francisco. I'm on about 800 stations on Saturdays and Sunday mornings on the Westwood One radio network.
Well, that is excellent. Thank you so much for coming on with us tonight, giving us some of your valuable time. You were a great guest, and we look forward to talking with you in the future.
Yes, please stay in touch. Love to be with you anytime, and thanks for the opportunity. And I'm so glad that we could talk about AAA, and let's hope that it's a go. It really looks like this time it's going to happen, and glad to be with you anytime.
Excellent. Thank you so much.
Thanks, guys.
All right. Will, sign guy. Wow.